Well, welcome everybody. I'm excited to get into some of these plant adaptations to heat and drought. Thank you so much, Amos, and your entire team for putting on this great water smart workshop series. The Weather the Drought webinars have been really good, and I'm looking forward to the ones. There's two more, I think, in 2 weeks and next month. So, yeah, I'm Marisa Thompson. I'm with New Mexico State University, and I love my job, and I get to share a bunch of plant pictures today that I've been saving for a good opportunity. So let's see. Let's get started. The picture I have in the background here are of penstemons, and so it's just such a great example of how a plant can be so beautiful and also really adapted to our environment. And so I have this little clip of a video that I took up in Los Alamos, let's see, at the at the nature center up there. It's the Pajarito Environmental Education Center. So, and look at these, in these images, the penstemons are beautiful, the flowers are beautiful, but also note all the different species, the kinds of colors you're seeing in the leaves, and those are clues about adaptations. Some are a little bit grayer, some are darker green, some have red stems. Or really narrow stems. Or even stems like evergreens. They look like the little leaves look like pine needles. So just trying to really broaden what we think of as what adaptations are. So adaptations are important because of our hot, dry, and extremely variable climate, even from one early in the day to later in the afternoon. Plants survive using remarkable adaptations, and it's fun to identify them as you go through your life and through your yard or your way to work. The plants around us are all showing these adaptations. Heat and drought, there are structural and physiological changes that occur within the plant in response to heat and drought, but also cold. So pigments and seasonal strategies for dealing with cold and sun, and that combination of where you may have extreme cold but really intense sunlight at the same time. So we're going to talk about heat and drought adaptations in trees and shrubs, in flowers, cacti and succulents, grasses, fruits and veggies. Basically, every single plant all around us already has these adaptations going on if you look close enough and kind of expand your idea of what these adaptations might be. A really common one that we'll see, that's easier to see more frequently because it's so common, is this physiological adaptations. And so it's these photosynthetic different types of photosynthesis that are happening. They are very different from plant to plant. So most of our plants use what we call C3 photosynthesis, okay, but there's also CAM photosynthesis. Examples like cacti and agave, but also yucca. And so in these examples, the photosynthesis happens at a different time, or the different stages and steps in photosynthesis happen at different times. That way that the stomata, or these little pores, can be open at night and allowing for less water loss. So that's one way with photosynthesis that some plants adapt. So this is separating day and night to conserve water. C4 is another photosynthetic pathway in which the different steps in this photosynthetic process are separated into different parts of the leaf or the stem. And in our biology classes, we learn about maize or corn and sorghum and amaranth as our classic examples of C4, but maybe you didn't know that we have a bunch of other great examples with our native grasses, these ornamental grasses like blue grama, side oats grama, alkali sacchaton. These are all using this C4 photosynthesis as an adaptation. Stomatal regulation and some examples in peach and tomato. But it's all true for all plants. So usually on the underside of the leaves, there are stomates or stomata. These are little pores. The individual pore is called a stoma. And the pores are regulated by temperature, wind, humidity, heat, that's temperature. And they close down when there's a period of stress, like when there's not water available. And when the plant is concerned or, concerned that there's going to lose too much water. So the example I like to give for stomatal regulation in tomato is maybe you have tomatoes that are growing in your yard, and usually you water in the mornings, or every couple of days you water in the morning, but there's a day that you forget. And then you get home in the afternoon, it's the heat of the day, and you water because the plant is really wimping out. But because those stomates may be closed in that hottest part of the day, even though there's water now around the roots, the plant is not taking up the water as much because those stomates are closed. It's almost like it's holding its breath until the temperatures drop in the evening, and then the stomates can open up and your plant will all of a sudden start perking up again, and the leaves get turgid with all of the water that has been taken up. So stomatal regulation is happening in all of our plants. And when you see a plant that's wilting, that's a clue that you may have a water issue in the soil. It may be too hot for the plants. So watch out for that. And then there's also osmotic adjustment. And so examples include sunflowers and sacchaton again. This is this plant adaptation to dehydration and salinity stress that involves the accumulation of salts in different tissues to allow for more water to be drawn up and less salt stress. So agave is that beautiful, this is a picture I took just this week, and it's a wonderful example, all the different species of agaves that are using this different form of photosynthesis. That's one of their tricks. But they also have these really thick leaves. The leaves are real fleshy. There's water that's stored in the leaf material. And so that's one of the ways that this plant is protected. Also notice, it's not true for all of the agaves, but in this one and in several of them, that light gray color is an adaptation for our heats and sun stress. So imagine, you just knowing that the type of car you have the color of your car has an effect on how hot it gets inside your car. And the lighter or whiter that a car is, or that a color on a plant or on a car, the less sunlight that is absorbed into that either plant tissue or the car material itself. So then the darker the color, the more sunlight is absorbed into that plant tissue. So having this real frosted green look is a very clear sign of that adaptation, so that it's able to reflect some of that sunlight that's coming in. Of course, we know plants need sunlight for photosynthesis and for transpiration. They need that drawing up of the water, and yet we have a lot of sunlight here. So by being a frosted pale green color, like in this agave, that is one of its protective mechanisms. And so now, and maybe you already know this, but whether you knew it before or not, just looking around at the plants that are thriving in our landscapes, many of them have this either a paler or frosty kind of whitish green color, maybe sage green. Another example I have is with apples. So these are apple blossoms. and they're a beautiful flower. But you may have seen before that in the winter, the stems have all of this fuzz on them. So note that dark red color, we'll come back to that, but the fuzz itself is a protective adaptation for sun stress in the winter, also for cold stress in the winter. So that is one way. These little hairs, you may not, it's not immediately obvious how much these little hairs can have an effect on the temperature within that tissue, but it's extreme. Also, the little hairs themselves, they protect especially when the hairs are around those little stomatal openings we were talking about. When the hairs around there, they help to regulate the humidity right at that little pore. And so that helps the plant to then decide better whether the stomates should be open or closed. So morphological adaptations, these are the ones that we're seeing so obviously. So we have, sure, small, thick, hairy leaves and stems, right? Just like in that apple. Saltbush is an example. Apache plume is an example. When we love looking at those beautiful flowers and the seed heads, but also the little leaves themselves. They're small and there's a lot of space where sunlight is not going to be accumulated too much in those leaves. So by having little tiny, I don't know if y'all can see the plant I'm holding up, but I have here another example of a plant with really tiny leaves. So this one, these are leaflets. This is a mesquite from my yard. So having this different type of leaf area is one of these adaptations. Okay, another morphological adaptation that we can't see as easily is the either deep tap roots and also shallow fibrous roots. They're different ends of the root spectrum, but both are adaptations that allow the plant to take advantage of its conditions right around it, and the plants that are in the riparian area having often more deep tap roots, but also not all of our plants do that. And as we learn in our tree classes, a lot of our plants, not just trees, but shrubs and these cacti, have real shallow roots that are doing most of the activity of drawing water up. Waxy cuticles. So what that means is waxy cuticles, it's like just like a cuticles on our body, it's a little flap of skin, but on leaves, it's a little layer of tissue that is on top and on bottom sometimes of the leaf. And it causes the plant to be able to hold more water, just like anything you dipped in wax would be able to hold more moisture. So that is, those are examples of these morphological adaptations. And I have a bunch of pictures to show of these waxy cuticles. So examples that are given here are creosote and desert willow, but we'll have a bunch more. Then we already talked about this a little bit, these succulent tissues like in cacti and agaves and in euphorbia. So these plants have an ability to store more water in the tissues, whether it's leaves or stems. And have a barrel cactus there's a lot of capacity for water storage, and the barrel cacti have these ridges on the sides that can expand, allowing the plant to suck up more water, or to squeeze down a little bit if it's especially dry and still be able to live and thrive. So an example of one of these morphological traits is the gray color and this artemisia. So I love these there's so many different species of artemisia that grow well in our landscapes. And if you see one or you're not sure if it's one, you can touch it and feel how most of them are super soft. Like you'd think that this shrub that is surviving and thriving in really hot climates would be really rough and even pokey, but it's soft, almost velvety, and the leaves themselves are covered in tiny, tiny little hairs that help with that silvery appearance and help as an adaptation. Another plant that has this silvery leaves are artichokes. So In this image, you can see the artichoke, the part of the artichoke that we eat, but then the leaves themselves tend to be gray and very fuzzy, and this real fine fuzz across all of these leaf tissues. And then, of course, the artichoke, if we don't eat it, then that bud opens up into a beautiful flower. Earlier this week at an event that we had with master gardeners up in Bernalillo, I was taking pictures of the group, and so that's nice, but I noticed that there's ash trees behind the group, and I'm going to zoom in a second. So this is late in the afternoon, and I noticed that the leaves behind there and way up on the top of that tree, I think maybe you can see my mouse if I circle around here, these leaves, they were pointed in a certain direction, so I got closer to go see, to look and be able to take pictures for this webinar. So notice here that these leaves, at first it just looks like they're normal, but then what we're seeing here are the backs of all of these leaves, the underside of the leaves. And I don't know for sure, but I believe this is an example of an adaptation to sun stress. So by folding up these plants are able to reduce perhaps the amount of photosynthesis that they're having to undergo so that they can have a little bit of a break maybe in the afternoon, or maybe this is just how the new tissue in this Arizona ash grows. I gave another example. I pulled down one of those leaves so that you can see, this is, when you pull it down, you see that there's that waxy cuticle, it's shiny, right? And so that's the top of the leaf. And then again, here's that leaf way up at the top of the tree that has, it's the underside of the leaves are what are being directed towards the sunlight. And it seems to me to be intentional. Another thing about these Arizona ash trees that were around that got me thinking about adaptations has to do with our sun leaves versus shade leaves. So these two pictures are taken of the same tree. There's an outer leaf, and I'm holding in my hand one of the leaflets. It's a leaf that is compound leaf. And as I'm holding it, I could feel how rigid it is. And so that's another adaptation to allow the plant to hold on to more water in the leaf tissue. And we noticed that the canopy, on the inside of the canopy, was really lush on this particular tree. And I wonder what the feeling of the leaves are underneath there and deep in the canopy. So let's zoom in a little bit more. Sure enough, when I plucked off leaves from the sunny leaves from the outside and shade leaves from the interior of the tree canopy, you could close your eyes and feel the difference. And that's something that we often forget when we're pruning, that this importance of having these sun leaves on the outside of a plant. For example, with an ash, it's true in a lot of our other plants too. So these sun leaves it's almost like they're just acting as shade for the rest of the plant. Sure, there is some photosynthesis that's happening in there, but on the hottest parts of the day, in the heat of the summer, the outer leaves on these trees have a slower, lower photosynthetic rate because they have to shut down. The stomates close and they have to shut down in order to conserve water. And then they're just acting then as shade. Whereas the tiny leaves, or smaller often, these leaves on the inside of the canopy, they are the shade leaves that at the same time as the sun leaves have tried to shut down their photosynthetic rate so that they can conserve water and conserve energy. The shade leaves are photosynthesizing maximally at that same moment. And so that's an example of these amazing adaptations to heat. So when you remove a bunch of the sun leaves, you can shock your plant because the leaves on the inside, they've just been already adapted as they've grown for that shadier portion of the canopy and more efficient photosynthesis. Okay, so some other kinds of adaptations, and we're going to just really cross over because every plant has a mixture of these different types. But these are interesting. So phenological adaptations, that means the timing, the seasonal timing of these different adaptations. So an example being ephemeral annuals, or annuals that, like the desert marigold, blazing star, and there's many, many more, that are able to push flowers or push new growth just after a rain, instead of pushing that growth maybe in the very beginning of May. I mean, they're growing, but they have a nice spurt of growth right after a rain. That's a clue that you may be seeing that ephemeral phenological adaptation. And in that first example with the penstemons also they can put on a flush of growth around the base of the plant that is leafy growth. It's not necessarily flowers, but that helps to allow more photosynthesis for the health of the plant, but also shade the roots just underneath the plant so that it's more protected and the roots can be cooler and have a little bit more of a hospitable environment for growing. Another phenological adaptation is this seed dormancy, and there are many examples. Some examples might include Indian rice grass and desert poppies, where the seeds themselves are able to, it's as though there's little clocks inside the seeds, but the different hormone levels in the seed are regulated through time by temperature, by moisture, and so by allowing for a type of seed dormancy, they're able to adapt and then either produce seed or germinate the seed at these really prime times when, for example, we're having our monsoon rains. And then another example of this seasonal dormancy with leaf tissue is in our bulbs. So whether we're talking about daffodils, crocus, saffron, think about it. These are blooming. These photos I took here in Los Lunas in March, a couple of years ago, but in March. And so then for most of the hottest, driest part of our season, they're not around. The leaves may still be there, but they're not actively growing. And so that is an adaptation that allows it to get through these winters. And or get through the summers, go through the winters, and then bloom again in the late winter. And I mentioned crocus there because we have spring blooming crocus. It's a type of, it's not really a bulb, it's a corm, but we also have fall blooming crocus that we're studying across the state at New Mexico State University, at some of our research farms across the state, including here in Los Lunas. And this example of these fall blooming saffron crocus. So I have here, this is from my yard. In November, they're blooming. And I just want to point out that before they're blooming, that means that these still are dormant through the hottest, driest parts of our summer. And so that is what is making it an interesting plant to be growing in New Mexico, maybe something that we can be growing more of. That's why we're studying it. So in the case of the saffron crocus, when you want to harvest your saffron, you're only harvesting those red tissues. So those are red stigmas. And so you're harvesting those as your seasoning or the herb that you're collecting. The flower itself is beautiful. I have some more pictures. So this was on blooming in my yard November 18, 2019. And then also there's a little grasshopper at the bottom right here that I didn't notice until I was looking closer at this photo. He just stood there completely still so that I wouldn't see him. So these are, again, they're blooming in the fall, but they, like the spring blooming crocus, are dormant through that summertime period. And another picture, so in this case, I planted these saffron in my yard in October of 2019. And then the photo that I took here was in late October in 2022. And so for most of the hottest part of the year, these are dormant. Another example that's common in a lot of our landscapes is catmint. So I took this picture just to show that frosted color, but also there's little tiny, teeny, tiny hairs. And when you turn the leaf over, you can kind of see those hairs a little bit better. But they are occurring all over the leaf tissue as an adaptation for sun stress, heat stress, drought stress. and then chocolate flower. So this picture of the chocolate flower is showing that wide basal growth. So the green growth that's just there at the base of the plant is encouraged by rain to really plume out and, like we said earlier, protect some of those roots by keeping the roots a little bit cooler. So an example of an adaptation there. Kota or Navajo tea, or also called Indian tea. This is a plant that, and I don't have a zoomed in picture, but if you look closely, you see that it has these gray-green stems, and there's a cholla behind it that's also gray-green, so that's an adaptation for sure. But look at the Kota stems here. They have this gray-green color, and the leaves look like little skinny stems. These are extremely adapted for reducing the amount of sun stress that these plants experience, because we see them on the side of the road blooming and thriving through the summer. This is one way that they're able to do that. And also, Kota is another example of a plant that is taking advantage of the seasonal morphological changes and phenological changes that can occur in order to encourage it to bloom again and bloom again in response to just being after a rain. So these thread-like leaves, they are minimizing water loss in addition to minimizing the photosynthetic load. Cottonwood is an interesting example because we don't think of cottonwoods as being particularly drought adapted, although they thrive in our climate, but we do know that they are a water-loving plant and grow best when they're close to the river and close to streams, close to groundwater. But I chose this as a picture, so I'm trying to show that the amount of light that is being reflected in this early morning sun on these leaves, this is another example of how cottonwoods, one of the ways that cottonwoods are adapted to our high intense sunlight and heat. So by reflecting more of that sunlight, they are having to do less work within the leaf with photosynthetic rate, but also that waxy cuticle that is causing that shininess is helping to hold water inside the leaf tissue. Another beautiful example in Datura. So this Datura is up at the Santa Fe Opera House, and this one is here in our garden and the courtyard garden in Los Lunas. And the flowers are beautiful, so we love those. But also thinking about where they grow. So this photo at Elephant Butte. In this picture, this plant looks relatively green, right? Bright green in the foreground. And it's because it's in relation to the plant, the brownness around it. But here's one in my yard with an artemisia there too, showing that it does have that silvery gray foliage that is an adaptation to heat and drought stress and that fuzziness too. And then even so, you can see in some of these pictures there are the flower buds that have not yet opened. So when you get really close to one of these flower buds, you can see all these little hairs. And so again, those hairs are acting as, for several reasons, but for one thing they're doing is protecting that tissue right around the stomatal opening so that the plant is able to better regulate when the stomates are open and closed in response to heat stress and drought stress. Another beautiful example of the fuzziness is with my favorite New Mexico wildflower, the desert marigold. So this picture is also from Elephant Butte Lake and in February one year. And so that real fuzzy growth is absolutely an adaptation to heat stress, sun stress, and also protecting against water loss. Desert marigold, when it blooms, is also beautiful. And so you can see the flowers here. I don't have another photo of the foliage, but it has that gray-green color and fuzziness, not as much as when it's a tiny young plant. So that's some things that plants may do, is that in the new growth or in the budding growth just after germination, the fuzziness helps to protect that really young, tender tissue. And then as the plant is maturing, and it's not necessarily a young plant, but the fuzz stays on as a protective adaptation. Desert willow, there's a lot of examples of how desert willows adapted in our environment. And so in this image, I was trying to point out, I was trying to catch the sunlight, because sure enough, there are waxy cuticle. The leaves have a waxy surface. It's not, I don't immediately think of desert willow as being the waxiest surface leaf, but they do have it. Sure enough, the sunlight is reflecting off of them in that way that's indicative of that waxy leaf surface. And also the narrow leaves themselves help to limit water loss. And then another way that this plant and many are adapted to our heat stress is that sometimes in heat and drought, extreme circumstances, the desert willow is able to drop some of its leaves as a almost similar to holding its breath until hold on and conserve resources until temperatures cool and or the rains come and temperatures cool from that. Figs grow well in our climate when you can get them through the winter. So if you've ever felt a fig leaf, it is extremely rigid and almost sandpapery, and those are clues that those are adaptations for extreme heat stress and water stress. Four-winged saltbush. So four-winged saltbush is one, it's called saltbush because it thrives in salty situations and it's one of those osmotic pressure adaptations where it's able to draw up water, even if it's saline water, and the way that it moves salts around in its tissues is an adaptation to our desert environment and drought and heat climates. This is one of my favorite examples of an adaptation. These are gazanias, and they're not native in New Mexico, but I took these pictures in Las Cruces, and maybe next time you see one, and maybe you've noticed this before, but in that picture on the right, I am pulling back the leaves so that you can see underneath the leaves often are extremely bright white and fuzzy. And so the plant itself, in response to extreme sun and heat on a really hot day, the leaves, it's called etiolation. The leaves themselves are able to turn, exposing that underside of the leaf that is more white, and so that more sunlight is reflected and less heat is absorbed by the plant. Lower photosynthetic rate, less stress. So what an amazing adaptation. So sure enough, you'll see, and other plants do this too, where the leaves curl up. Sometimes they curl and rotate. Sometimes they just kind of squish up in response to sun stress. The silveriness, it's not just that it's white, it also has the silveriness that helps with the reflecting intense sunlight. And jujubes, man, when you walk through a jujube orchard like we have here in Los Lunas, you see the amount of sunlight that is being reflected from these waxy cuticle leaves. And sure enough, this plant is very well adapted to our environment, even though it's not native in the Southwest or in North America. Well, actually, there are jujubes that are native in Florida and also in South Texas, but this is the type of jujube that is not native here. And also notice that red stem. We're going to get into that more. Leucophyllum is maybe one of the most classic examples of a plant that has an incredible adaptation to heat stress and our summer conditions, drought stress, really, and that the flowers and the buds are encouraged to come on and to bloom right after or as close after seasonal rain events. And it's partly in response to the atmospheric pressure, and it's like being able to tell it's like a weather channel that's telling you that the rains are coming or moist air is coming, and that when you see the plant really explode in buds and then bloom. So these blooms I took, or these pictures I took of Texas Ranger, Texas sage, also called, in a parking lot here in Los Lunas just last week. Sure enough, right after one of our heavy summer rains that we enjoyed. This one kind of surprised me. So this is true, of course, for many plants, but in the example of little leaf sumac, if you know it, you know that it has cute little leaflets, right? That's why we call it little leaf, and it's a beautiful shrub in our climate. But as I saw that just when the sun's going down, this is from earlier this week too, I noticed that there's this sheen kind of, or like a little glow around the, like a halo around the edge of these leaflets. So we can zoom in more and then zoom in more and see, look at how many tiny hairs there are. So this is one that, I mean, I know what little leaf sumac looks like, and I am a fan of the sumacs, but I hadn't looked this closely before, and I didn't know that this is one of the reasons that it can thrive so much in our hot climate, is that all those tiny little hairs on the stem and also on the undersides of the leaves and also on the tops of the leaves. It's really amazing how fuzzy it is. So sometimes it's hard to get a picture of the way the waxy cuticle is reflecting light. One way to make it a little bit easier is to go out at night and use a flash. So this is the mulberry in my yard. Man, not only are the leaves rigid, and so they're able to hold water more, but they also have that waxy cuticle, sure enough, that is reflecting a lot of the sunlight. And these trees thrive in our landscapes, those of us that have them. Also, this morning when I was passing by this mulberry, I went up to some of the outer leaves, again, those sun leaves, and compared the feel of the leaf, and I have them here with me, of the sun leaves, the outer leaves that are more rigid, to the softer leaves that are found deeper inside the canopy. So it does take energy for these plants to put on extra waxy cuticles or extra hairs. And so if energy can be conserved because the leaves are in the shade and so they don't need all of that armor, then they don't use it. So sure enough, if I'm curious, if you go up to a mulberry and you feel the leaf out in the sun and then go into one of those underneath real deep canopy leaves and feel them to see the difference. Netleaf hackberry, another wonderful plant that has these adaptations, and sure enough, it sounds like sandpaper when you run the leaf in your next to your ear, or you can even feel it and feel that it's sandpapery. And again, we have like that. That's a dark stem, a little bit of a reddishness. Note that. Speaking of reddishness, so for ocotillos, this picture on the right, excuse me, on the left, and here, this other one on the right, these are pictures I took down in Las Cruces, and I was excited to see just before this one had completely leafed out, that how red the stem is. And the spines themselves, these are extremely dark red color. The ocotillo is one that will look, sometimes it looks like it's dead earlier in the season, and then it leafs out almost like instantaneously, it seems like, after in response to a rain. So this is an ocotillo picture I took earlier this week. And I just want to point out that, so this is leafed out because of the rains, okay, but even if it didn't have leaves, so if you imagine, if you zoom in on that stem and imagine that the leaves have fallen off, see the green lines, the green tissue that's in the bark that is exposed there? This is one of these adaptations where the plant is able to photosynthesize even without leaves, because there's that green chlorophyll and the tissues in the stem itself. The other example, or well, there's so many, but another example being ocotillo. So the spines in ocotillo and also in our barrel cactus and cholla, those are modified leaves. And so the green that we see on those plants is the stem or the trunk of the plant. And that's where photosynthesis is happening. And the spines are, like I said, modified leaves. And another example, these pictures are from Las Cruces, of Palo Verde wood. So in Palo Verdes, one of the ways that they handle heat stress and water stress is by having a lot of photosynthesis occur in the trunk tissue itself. So here the branches and the trunks are green. And so, and this, I don't know if you were able to see the Climate Ready Trees presentation I gave 2 weeks ago, but in thinking about trees that can handle our heat stress going forward, even though Palo Verde may not be cold hardy in your yard now, there are clues that it is well adapted to heat stress and sun stress and drought stress. So that's why it's on lists of climate ready trees for the Albuquerque area into the future. Okay, let's talk more about, we mentioned peaches earlier on because of the way that the stomates are used to control heat and water loss in the leaf tissue. But notice that in these two images, I'm showing peach stems with peach buds early in the season. So this is probably, both of these are probably taken in March. But notice that in one, the stem is this bright green, kind of a normal green looking color, and the other is this notably dark red. And if I were to turn over the branch on the right there, you'd see that it's green on the other side. So let's talk a little bit about pigment-based adaptations. So there are many different plant pigments, and some of them are, for example, chlorophyll is a plant pigment that's where photosynthesis happens in the cells, and it's a green color, but there are other pigments. So I'll focus more on anthocyanins. So anthocyanins are red and purple pigments in leaves, in stems, in fruit, and they have an incredible ability to protect, almost like we think of sunscreen and like a suntan lotion. And so that it's not that when you see a red tissue, it's not that there isn't also chlorophyll there and green tissue. It's that these pigments that are causing the red color are they're like they're easier for us to see. They're taking over the visible light spectrum. And as an example of something that has sometimes not so clear adaptation to our conditions. So these dark red, purple pigments, can be protective in young tissues like oaks and maple and tomato seedlings, and I have a bunch more examples, but they also protect from cold stress. For example, in kale and in chili peppers, young peppers, and also in saffron. These pigments are able to absorb UV or blue light, and so they're reducing photoinhibition. So that's reducing the photosynthetic stress on the plant. They also act as antioxidants and stress signals in plants. So anthocyanins basically are pigments that turn tissues red or purple. So see in this peach stem, it's a very obvious example, but I also want to show you how striking these differences can be. So in this picture, I've gone out to the peach orchard here in Los Lunas, and I took one of the stems that's green, and I took a cutting of another stem and turned it around so that you could see comparisons side by side that and either of these, if you rotated them, you'd see the other color on the other side. It's really remarkable. So the red side is the side that is more exposed to sunlight. So it's facing either up to the sky or over towards the southwest for our intense afternoon sun in February or March when this picture was taken. And the underside is green because, yes, the red color is helping with photoinhibition and photosynthetic rate, but it is costly. It does take energy for the plant to produce those pigments. So on the underside of the same stem, there's no need for them because that's shaded. Other examples, so roses have a lot of different adaptations for our hot environment, but the new growth you see, even just this picture is from this morning of a woods rose, the native rose here in our learning garden. This young tissue has that redder color compared to the rest of the plant. And some more examples, so going across from top left to the right, we have an example of young rose growth, and the middle top it's kind of hard to see there, but this is a pomegranate, that the new growth, that stem that's there deep in the center, is a bright red color. Then we have our tree of heaven, which is not a tree that we want to encourage in our environments, but sure enough, it's also an example of that really bright red that can occur on those young leaves as a protective mechanism. And then we have as an example of some of these redbud leaves. Yeah, we also have lamb's quarter, the chinkapin oak. I mean, when you start looking for it, you see this red phenomenon all over the place, both as a winter heat and cold protectant, but also as a sun protectant in the summer. So these are leaves from my redbud showing this variation in color, the newest growth being a brighter red as a protectant for that really young tissue. One thing I just noticed in the last year is that I had at my redbud, the base of the tree, there was a stalk coming up from the rootstock, a sucker coming up. And the leaves on that sucker were not waxy. They were dull looking and softer, flimsier than the leaves on the redbud that I had tried to plant, the original redbud. And sure enough, when you look at the list of climate-ready trees for Albuquerque, you see there's a list of redbuds, Mexican, Oklahoma, Western redbud, that are recommended for our climate, but there are other species that are not recommended, and partly because they don't have some things like these adaptation with the waxy cuticles. So if you see a redbud that has really muted, matte color instead of the shiny with the leaves, that's a clue that it may not be one of the ones that's listed on the climate ready trees lists or lists like that. Okay, so of course there's yuccas, and those are incredible examples of that pale green color and the succulent ability to store water. There's many other adaptations. But we don't think about tomatoes as having as many adaptations. So when I got close to the tomatoes we're studying here, I was able to get these pictures of these tiny little fine hairs that are protective and that they are reflecting sunlight, these silvery hairs that help to mediate humidity around the stomata. And there's also different varieties that are more fuzzy or more tolerant to drought. I was trying to get the pictures of, because in the sunlight this morning, you could really see that it's almost like they were sparkling, these little leaves, these leaflets on tomatoes. So I was trying to get that in these pictures. I don't know if I quite caught it. And I've saved oaks for the end here. I love oaks. A lot of us love oaks. Remember, quercus is our purpose. And so this is just a little video showing these examples of rigid leaves. Some are gray. Different species of oaks have different mechanisms for adapting to hot climates. A bunch of these pictures I took in Arizona. So you can see that's the leaf shape, the bright reflectance, that gray color. These are all different examples of adaptation. And this chinkapin, I noticed, sure enough, that red color right there on the bark. So I have some questions, and I am just, as I look at the plants around, and really, when you just walk out of your office door or your home door, and the first plant you encounter, you can walk up to it and investigate, see what you think might be some of these adaptations. But I wondered about some of these things that we think might be negative and how they might be beneficial. So here's a beautiful sunflower. This was in my front yard. But we also get pictures like this showing some leaf damage. And I wondered, could it be, I don't know for sure, but could it be that sometimes the damage we're seeing by pests, maybe this is helping this sunflower leaf in the hottest part of the summer to reduce some of the leaf area and reduce its photosynthetic load. Okay, maybe. Sunflowers also have all these beautiful little hairs. And I wondered, as I was getting closer and looking at these pictures, taking pictures of the hairs, I also noticed that there's this, it's not waxy, but the sticky residue on the leaf surface here, and you can kind of see it here, that is giving these leaves a sheen, and it is the result of insect honeydew that has covered, almost coated that leaf surface, but it does make it more reflective. And so you can kind of see that in this image, that there's more sunlight that's being reflected. So is there a possible benefit to having something like insect honeydew coating our leaves and making them maybe more like a waxy cuticle? And here I took this picture in our learning garden of Monarda. So the new growth doesn't show this, but the older growth has what I believe is a type of powdery mildew. And I wondered also, is then perhaps powdery mildew helping by reflecting more sunlight and alleviating some of the stress on these Monarda stems and leaves? Similarly, with something that we see a lot this time of year, mallow rust on hollyhock. So neither powdery mildew nor this mallow rust, and really the other examples too, there's nothing to do about them. It's not a bad thing, but I wondered, maybe this mallow rust, see how it's reducing the amount of area on the leaf surface that is capable of photosynthesis? Is that a little bit of a protective mechanism? Is it kind of helping the leaf out? These are kind of, these are more extreme examples. I don't know, but I suspect as you learn more, as I learn more about ecology and how all these are tied in together, I wonder about things that we call pests, and maybe they have some pros. And maybe again, this is pushing the limits, but this is an aspen tree up outside of Taos that in September had these leaf miner indications, where a leaf miner got in and chewed that little yummy section in between the leaf surface and the underside of the leaf. And it also is reducing the amount of photosynthetic area of that leaf. One thing is that this is happening late in the season, like that mallow rust and like our powdery mildew. And so those leaves are close to the time of the year when the leaves are going to fall and leaves are going to senesce. So it's not that big of a problem. But I'm curious, when you step outside and see for yourself, what kinds of things are you going to see? This is just one example of the ways that I love my job, and I'm learning all the time about the plants around us and how we interact with them and how they interact with our environment. So with that, thank you.